With that, I'm excited that you're here for today's program with Jolene. And let me just tell you a little bit about this program and, of course, about Jolene. Today's program is Aren't Asians All Alike? And so really going to look around being Asian inclusive. One thing that I know about Jolene, number one, and I are the what we thought were the only two extroverted Asians in Seattle for a while, which we know is not true, but we thought that that was true. Jolene's been in the meeting industry for over a decade. She's was the CEO of Meeting Maximizers. She's produced over 500 events. She's also been the past president of the Northwest chapter of the Northwest Speakers Association. She did that for 3 years. And something else, if you didn't know, right, social justice is something that's built into Jolene Jang. She actually had something where it was called the upskirt controversy. People were shooting photographs up grates in one of Seattle's events, and there was no law preventing that. So she actually not only had this happen to her, but she took that along with it and got the work done. There is actually now a law passed because of Jolene that prevents this from happening. And so now she's been really focusing her work on Stop Asian Hate. She's educating companies on what they need to do to be Asian inclusive and show how they will be rewarded for it. Everyone put your hands in the air for the one and the only Jolene Jang.
And I have intro music. Oh, that is so fun.
There you go, Jolene.
Cool. Well, thanks, John, and Happy New Year to everybody. And thank you for all of you for being curious and taking the time to be here. And there's lots of things you could be doing, but you choose here, and thanks for the support. So today, the program is Aren't Asians All Alike? And please don't answer that. I will ask you later, and you will believe that no, Asians are not alike, and you're going to gain professionally and personally in many ways. So what you don't know could cost you. Isn't that rather intriguing? This presentation provides an overview on how to position your business to capitalize on the fastest growing American ethnic population that is $1.2 trillion in buying power, and while protecting your company from costly discrimination lawsuits. After this presentation, you will know more about historical roots of anti-Asian hate in the United States. You'll be more culturally sensitive to issues that Asians experience, and you'll better understand how to communicate more effectively with Asians. And you'll be able to help your company attract and retain Asian employees and clients. And you're going to see the need and the role of DEI programs, and to make sure that you add an Asian component for creating culturally competent workforce. Now, I did mention that I do have 44 hours that I was really trying hard to squeeze into this, and I can't, which frustrates me. But in this hour, I'm going to do my best to select what's foundational, and I'm sorry that I talk fast. After this presentation, we will have a Q&A and a discussion to talk about it and expand and talk about what we just talked about. And do use the chat. I won't be participating right now, but I will after. But John, our Zoom jockey, will be doing that. And do interact with each other. And I'd like to know what your questions are so we can answer them later. And before we get started, this is on Facebook Live somewhere in many places and YouTube. So I don't know if it's on mine right now, but if it is, you can go to my wall, Jolene Jang, and share it. And before we get started here, I want to give you an idea like where I'm coming from. I'm from Seattle, born and raised. And for decades, for a couple of decades, I've spoken about maximizing meetings and innovation and how to use the power of curiosity to come up with new ideas and new markets. And as John mentioned, I've been behind the scenes planning events, but also in front of the scenes. So in the hospitality industry, I know both sides. And I recently have turned my interest my focus to Aren't Asians All Alike and Stop Asian Hate, because it is a big problem right now. I am Japanese, Chinese, Swedish, and this is my family. So my mom and dad, which are on the call. So my father is Swedish and Chinese, and my mother is Japanese. And I have been a host mother to 35 international students, all from Asia. And before COVID, I have done lots of focus groups with Seattle Asians and listening to their lived experiences, which are rarely shared. And what I found is that all of them have not had the safe space to talk about being Asian. Now, I know it's hard for you to understand what it's like to be Asian, and that's a silly thing to ask you to do, but think about if there's been a time when you have felt unsafe. Maybe you're traveling and you take an exit and a couple wrong turns. You look around and you're in a different community, and people know it. They're staring at you, and you feel that uncomfortableness. And so you want to hightail it out of there. Perhaps you're setting up at a conference at a hotel, and it's 11 p.m. You have all this stuff, and it's this cavernous, dark garage. You think you're alone, but then you hear this kerfuffle, and then a cacophony over there. Have you felt unsafe? Likely, you probably haven't felt like that many times in your life. Unfortunately, for Asians, this may be a daily occurrence on their way to work, just at going grocery shopping, and even walking in their neighborhood. And I'm going to share with you why they feel like this. So this is your warning here that if you want to look away for a moment. So this is a minute, and it's going to be graphical.
No more. We're not gonna let you hold us down. We're gonna rise up and stand our ground. And we won't keep quiet no more. You lured us overseas, fed us lies so we'd believe that we could have everything you have. And we built your railroad tracks while you walked upon our backs. But in the end, we never got our half. With dynamite and rope put in our hands, all so you could go and take more land.
So this last one that you just saw is just outside of Seattle at a Buddhist temple in Tacoma. And this monk, a nun is being attacked. The senior nun is being attacked by 3 people. And there's an 80-year-old caretaker of the monk who is also attacked. So this is happening every day in communities across the United States. It's not limited to Chinatowns. Many Asians are concerned for our safety because we are targeted. The expressions of hate range from microaggressions to assault to murder. Most Asians are not going to report their hate incidents. In many cultures, we're just told to, keep our heads down, do what's good for the greater good, and nobody wants to hear it. Maintain harmony. So Asians are going to be reluctant to talk up, and that's my network included. I haven't reported mine. My aunt, when she was followed for 10 minutes, didn't report her. When 3 big white guys threatened my dad and says, "I'm going to kill you," my dad did call the cops, but they weren't interested. These are not isolated events. The police don't keep track of these incidents. So Stop Asian Hate org was formed because there was such an alarming escalation of xenophobia. And they recorded over 10,000 hate events. And that is a large number. But really, that is just a tiny fraction of reality. And there was a national survey published last November that said 1 in 5 Asians experienced a hate incident last year. That is 5 million Asian Americans who received hate last year. Because people are not aware of this hate, on my website, jolenejang.com, I have a timeline of attacks. So I thought maybe if people saw it and saw videos that they would believe their eyes. And I haven't updated, the last 2 weeks, but there's probably another 10 murders to put in there. So it is happening, and this is a good resource for people who think it doesn't happen. And over the last 291 days, I've been doing what I can to bring awareness with programs like this, because Asians are made to feel like they do not belong. And I wish more Americans would care about other Asian Americans, but my goal isn't to preach my morality. I'm going to give you a reason to care. I'm going to show you why it's smart business to be knowledgeable about Asian cultures, particularly if you're in the hospitality field. So why should you care if you are not Asian? Well, consider this. Asians have the highest income, the highest education level. They're the fastest growing population, and they have a high buying power of 1.2 trillion. Their buying power is approaching of that of the Black and Hispanic populations, which are double and triple the population. So do you want a piece of this market? There are companies like this who are seeing, oh, there's an opportunity. So Oakley, of course, you've heard of, they make Asian fit sunglasses. And in the upper corner, you see there's other sunglasses. This is Maui Jim's in Hawaii. And, Asian fit also. And it's $350. These are not low end. So there is opportunity here. And in the middle, there is Nimble Made. And this is a gentleman's apparel. And, they're, $60, $80 for a shirt. And Pepper is the bra that's made for Asians. And what's kind of funny, I was researching this and now I get all these ads from all the platforms of these bras. So thanks for the research. So there's a lot of opportunity. It's underserved. And besides retail, there are some major companies that are paying attention to this who want to cash in on this. Netflix, after George Floyd was murdered, they had put together and popped up their Black stories. And then last May for Asian Pacific Heritage Islander Month, they highlighted Asian American stories. So it is, things are going, but it's because pressure from the Asians who are in-house and like myself. And you have heard of Shang-Chi, the partnership between Marvel and Disney, and this broke all sorts of records. This film surpassed 100 million in 5 days, the fastest film to reach this milestone since Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. So let's see, worldwide, they've grossed $432 million. And think of all the companies who can make out from this with merchandising. So whatever lunch pails, I don't know if they still make those, action figures, costumes, maybe even themed events. So let's go to our first poll and think about, well, how does this affect the meetings industry? So let's take a look there. So let's pull up the poll and ask, what percentage of hotels and motels in the US are owned by Asian Americans? Think about that. And do you work with hotels? Are you a caterer? Are you a meeting planner? Do you do destination management? Do your clients work at hotels? How are you connected to hotels? Okay, and let's take a look here. It looks like the guesses are 30%. Most of you are guessing that it is 20%. I would have guessed 10%. The answer is actually 60%. I think that is shocking to me. So follow-up question, what happens in Texas? What do you think the answer is in Texas? And we certainly hear Texas in the news a lot of times. And I particularly hear a lot about the racism in Texas. So how many do you think are Asian-owned, American-owned in Texas? Interesting. Yeah. So the answer is, a lot of you guessed 40%. The answer is 80%. So now you put this together with this new stat here, with this article. So in the LA Times, by the way, is Korean owned. While U.S. chains are cutting back on their hotels and they're investing, Japanese and Chinese owned companies are aggressively buying and building new luxury properties in America. So think about this. With currently 60% are already Asian American owned, and then Chinese and Japanese are now owning up all the luxury brands. So where do you want to be? And how are you going to compete? So you got to think about that, because if you don't understand Asian culture, you are not going to get that business. Absolutely not. And let's think of another industry. So just in the chat, write what you think. Which industry has a lot of money, does a lot of launches, does work at hotels, and has a bunch of Asian employees? In the chat, go ahead and answer that. Yep, exactly. And yeah, tech, of course, is tech. And in Silicon Valley, they're 50% Asian. So where do you think they're going to spend their money? They're going to spend their money where they feel safe and respected. So let's look at tourism for a second here. This is Asians visiting America. It's 12 million visitors from Asia every year for the last 5 years. Now, when that picks up again, where do you want to be? The Japanese and Chinese are buying up those luxury hotels because they're like, yeah, you know, Americans don't really know how to sell to us, but we know how to sell to us. So how do you want to capitalize on this Asian market? How do you do it? Well, it begins with your training. Let's pop this over here. So let's talk about the evolution of diversity and training. Just pull out of the way. So it started off for 50 years. It began because of the civil rights in 1964. And it was about legislation and compliance to save from getting sued. And there was African Americans are speaking up and in the workforce. And so, hey, let's not get sued. And then in the 80s, with the Reagan Revolution and all this deregulation, they are like, you know what? Okay, we may not get sued, but so let's try and get the new populations like the women and LGBT who are now in the workforce. Let's just get them to assimilate. Let's have them be like the dominant culture, the white male culture. And then up to the 2000s, so the impact of global and migration. So now we are diverse. So the idea is to actually be competent and learn skills. And where are Asians on this? Well, I think we're adding them right now. And I'm hopeful. So think about your DEI's program. You know, what phase are you in? Is it evolving? And or is it more at compliance? Because if you want to be successful, you can't just be a checkbox situation. So does your diversity program address Asian Americans, or are you just grouping them with, 100 other countries, people from other countries under the title of people of color? So there are a handful of progressive tech companies that are starting the DE programs, but we're hoping for more. So tell your friends. The government is recognizing the impact of Stop Asian Hate, and Biden signed a Stop Asian Hate bill last year, and it was a fantastic speech. I was crying. I was just, oh my gosh, he really understands. It was really well written. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission said that they will use all the tools in the agency to combat anti-Asian hate and racism. And locally, there were 26 governors who signed on acknowledging that they do need to combat Asian hate. So what are you going to do? First, we need to learn to recognize the expressions of hate. What I'm going to do is share with you the current climate for Asians in America. And remember that 1 in 5 Asians have been impacted in this last year. And your Asian employees and clients are impacted. And you can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is, if you can't recognize it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you what it looks like and how to recognize it. It can be overt or it can be subtle. And it's not just seniors, it's not just women, it's not just men, it's kids too. And you may be surprised that it is also professional athletes and Olympiads, and also Suni Lee. So let's explore the ways that on a daily basis, what your employees, your Asian employees and friends may be going through. So let's just take a peek here. So just on a daily schedule. So here's a sign, kill all Chinese people. And construction sign with a rice paddy hat and start Asian hate. License plate that says Asian flu, basically blaming Asians for COVID. This is in Seattle, Chinatown. And with these First National, these are white supremacist signs. And this Japanese American got some coffee, came back out to her car, and there's a cup of urine that says die, kill, die. How would you feel if somebody had these words towards you and you know that Asians have been attacked and murdered? Yeah, scary. And simply, on a daily basis, going to the store, to CVS, to FedEx, to fast food, they all say ching chong. And if I were picking up some food that said ching chong, I don't believe that person didn't spit or do something bad in it. And this letter was mailed to this widow celebrating the death of her husband and saying, yeah, one more or less Asian to worry about. Watch out. So there's many ways. Oh, and this lady, she was just walking down the street and she was set on fire. And this Cambodian gentleman and also his Asian neighbor, their cars were torched. Their neighbors were not, but they are Asian. So are you seeing? Here I am. Hello. Are you seeing how hate is coming from all different directions? And we didn't even talk about subtleties. So it is very stressful just on the daily things that we do. I don't walk alone. I do not walk alone. I don't go to the store alone. I don't do anything alone. And some of you know who I am. I'm kind of a tough gal here. So it's very stressful. So when I went bike riding this last summer, so basically my friend thought nothing of this, but what I remembered was this. I remembered when this guy, this Asian, he was cut up by hacksaw and put in a bag by these 3 guys. So that was my memory of what happened. Have you heard of any of these Asians who were killed? No, you probably have not, because all the bandwidth was taken up by missing white woman syndrome, Gabby Petito. It's stressful. So think about your employees. There's a lot going on there. So when you think about, oh, it's not a big deal, I don't see it. Even if your Asian friends or employees were not attacked, they feel it. And they may need to change their walking routes and rethink how they do transportation. And we also have to be careful when we cough in public. True story. And think about these Asian employees. Do you know them? Do you know their ethnicity or how they identify? Do you know their family? How much do you know about your culture? Because we're a lot of times not told to talk about our culture. Hey, just go along. We're all the same. There's a lot of work to be done. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So remember this as you decide what you want to do and how you want to be. Hate is not new. It's been happening since Asians immigrated to the US, but since then it feels like the attacks have been blatant and normalized. So now you have this wide range of hate, and understand a little bit better. Practice being aware and recognizing it. So now let's talk about the history of hate and then address how to gain access to the market by also being inclusive. So when it comes to developing a cultural competency, 3 elements are important. So knowledge, attitudes, and skills. So you want your program to be able to teach employees about other cultures and make them aware of any implicit biases and train them to communicate effectively. It's what we're going to do here is first learn about Asian cultures, and then we're going to do a brief historical background of Asian immigration to America to put our discussion into context. Then we're going to address perceptions and attitudes towards Asians. Now, our American education system doesn't include Asian Americans. Most children have not heard of the Japanese of Asian Americans at all, but they may have possibly had a paragraph about the Japanese internment camps. I don't recall learning about them. I know that I did a paper on them because I was president of the Asian Club, and I thought, let me learn. And so I talked to my relative who was willing to talk about it when he was in the camp. So I'm going to highlight a few historical events from the perspective of a Japanese, Chinese, Swedish power tool wielding, swing dancing culture explorer from Seattle. It's hard to believe that all Asians are categorized into one bucket. So I have a question for you. We have a little poll here. How many countries are there? 21, 36, 48, 67, 72. Now, if you asked me maybe 8 months ago to name Asian countries, I'd probably be able to come up with 12. So I'm learning a lot as well. And we can't cover all the immigration from these countries because we do not have time. But we're going to talk about Japan and China. Just totally coincidental that I'm Japanese and Chinese. And after this brief timeline, you'll get a grasp of how people have perceived Asians over time. And you'll see that there's been a lot of animosity towards Asians historically, and you'll understand why. So, wow. Okay. I'm impressed. A number of you guessed correctly. Yeah, there are 48 countries. Not bad, not bad. Now, how many can you name? All right. Next question is, whoa, no, don't. Did you see that? From which Asian country did the first Asian person arrive? And we have a poll on this one. So my father and I went to Seattle, Chinatown about 4 years ago. I had no idea. My answer was wrong. And this group seems to be really assimilated. So what is your answer here? Oh, 33% are, oh, okay, it's neck and neck. So the answer is from the Philippines. So there was a Filipino sailor who came over in 1587. By the way, Filipinos are the third largest Asian ethnic group, and they have the second highest income of the Asians. So let's go to our timeline. So Filipinos arrived in 1587, but the main settlement was in Louisiana in 1763. And then the next wave here was for the gold rush. So we have the Chinese were fleeing the Opium Wars. And so they were miners and they worked for themselves and others. And in 1852, there was 20,000 Chinese immigrants in California. That's nearly 30% of all the immigrants. And white miners were not pleased. They don't like Chinese. They were resentful. And so what they did was basically they fought back with violence and legislation.
Tonight, something that doesn't happen too often at KSDK, a social post about one of our newscast segments has gone viral.
Wait, what is that?
And the attention of
can somebody mute?
Like NBC News, CNN, Newsweek, and the
Do you hear that?
Post.
The reason it's opening the conversation about
that's not mine.
Representation.
Okay, thank you. So, that is go to a smaller one. Okay, here we go. Got it. Okay, back on track. So what they did, because I didn't like Chinese, is they had anti-discrimination laws and violence. So that includes the foreign miner's license. So it was $20 that the Chinese person or the person who employs the Chinese person. And that actually was about the wage that they earned at that time. And of course, Chinese were robbed and they were also murdered. And then there was more legislation where Chinese were no longer able to testify. So what happened next is in 1865, the U.S. railroads recruited Chinese. So what happened is these railroads were being built, and the Pacific Railroad Company needed to recruit 5,000 for the toughest part of track, but they couldn't get any. The white immigrants definitely did not want to do this. And so even though they referred to the Chinese as dregs and degraded people, white people didn't want to hire them, but they needed the labor. The conditions were treacherous. They were daunting, and what they did was they were digging tunnels. Small Jolene, there we go. And the temperatures in the summer were 120 degrees to freezing, and there was 44 storms in one season. The Chinese, they made less and they worked harder. So Chinese were paid half to 2/3 the rate of the white immigrants, which was $1 a day. And unlike the white immigrants, they actually had to pay for the lodging and their food. So they dug tunnels and 1,776 miles of track. And for every 2 miles of track, 3 Chinese died. And here's a question for you, and you can just answer in the chat. At the completion of the railroad, what percentage was built by Chinese? Okay, I have a couple of guesses. Okay. Oh, these are good guesses. Oh, these are Asian allies speaking. That's why. Yeah, yeah. It looks like you're right in there. So the answer is 80%. 80% built. And then when you look at this picture, by the way, there are no Chinese. This was a celebration, and look at the work we did, but Chinese were not invited. So what was next is, so the railroads were done. So there's no use for Chinese. The white employers got their cheap labor and they hate Chinese. So they're done with them. So thus the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was the first law to prevent a specific group from immigrating to the United States. And it lasted for 60 years. So what do you think the impact on the Chinese that were actually living here? Do you think people were like, oh yeah, we still like them? No, this was the driving out period. You can imagine how much more this would have ignited hate. Mobs robbed and chased and killed them. And there were Chinese massacres. So a mob in LA, there were 500 white men entered LA, Chinatown, to attack and loot and murder. And they murdered 10% of the Chinese population. And here, there's just so many depictions, encouragement to Chinese immigration. And the anti-Chinese hatred became so normalized that it even was incorporated into advertising, selling washing machines. It says we have no more use for them, meaning Chinese, because we have this washing machine. So here we are today. Sorry, we don't accept Chinese customers. Again, today, this year, become a Kung Flu fighter. So instigating violence. So yeah, again, we have all this violence aimed at Chinese and other Asians. So let's look at the next wave of immigrants. So we have Japanese, the Chinese Exclusion Act that opened the doors because the United States needed cheap labor again. And so Japanese were recruited from Japan and Hawaii to replace the Chinese. So from 1901 to 1908, there was 127,000 Japanese. And a lot of them were farmers. My Japanese grandfather came over in 1912. So the Chinese were hated and the Japanese were recruited until they were hated a couple of years later. So they showed the hate through the California alien land law. So basically it says, hey, you were really good at farming, Japanese folks. So we're gonna make sure that you can't own land. And then in 1924 is the federal immigration ban, where this bans Japanese. It says just people, but it's enforced with Japanese. So then we have the World War II, and I hope you have heard of the executive order that says that all the Japanese need to evacuate the West Coast. So Japanese Americans were forced to leave. Let me leave here. I just left. To leave their stores, their farms, their businesses, and everything they own, except for one suitcase. They would be shipped and incarcerated in relocation centers where they lived in horse stalls with other families and with sheets for walls and pillows out of straws. And here, and this is in my parents' era, so here's a Jap hunting license. So its season is now open, no limit. Remember Pearl Harbor. And like you may hunt a moose or something and put the head on the wall, here's another Japanese license. So this is no joke. Here's an example of a bunch of them. So there was a lot of hate here. Oh, and I wanted to show that this was Dr. Seuss. I think, Dr. Seuss made the news not too long ago. And yeah, he had a lot of hate. And this is during World War II. So slap that Jap. And then bring it up to today, Twitter. This is 2021, slap an Asian challenge. So this is where teenagers got together and slapped an Asian. So hate has not gone away. And this is by the way, this is my my mom's family. So my mom is there in the center and my grandparents. And I'd like to ask you if you can put the poll out there. I'm curious how many of you know a Japanese American. I think that so many people believe that, oh, slavery was so long ago and the Holocaust so long ago. Did it happen? Japanese incarceration, ancient history, because people don't have connection to it. But if you are second to fourth generation, because first generation is dead, Japanese American, then they will know or be related to somebody who was incarcerated. So I want to let you know that it's not that long ago. And okay, all of you know a Japanese American. Well, that's good. I guess you all know me. Well, I encourage you, if they're a friend, you can ask them about their relatives. Don't push. Just be like, oh, I'm curious. I was on this program, and this Japanese American encouraged me to ask. You can position it that way, because there's a lot of stories out there. And if not, there's podcasts, and I have resources for you. So hate has not gone away. I want to talk to you, and you can see me now and bigger. There I am. Hate hasn't gone away, and attacks on Asians have increased. And I want to talk about two different stereotypes that are perpetuated by the media that have a profound impact on attitudes towards Asians. So the first stereotype involves perceptions of what it means to be American and an unconscious belief that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. For decades, Harvard University has been measuring attitudes using an instrument called implicit association tests. And I think you've all heard of this. And you can take this online and learn if you have implicit attitudes that you did not know about. For example, you may believe that women and men should be equally associated with science, but your automatic associations could show you, and like many others, that you associate men with science more than you associate women. So between 2007 and 2020, over 336,000 people took the tests that measure the associations between the concepts of Asian and American. And the results showed a subconscious belief that Asian Americans are more likely to be perceived as foreigners. However, over 13 years, there was a steady decline in that trend. So let's take a look at that. So what happened, there was a study published last year in the Journal of Health, Education, and Behavior revealed a reversal in the trend beginning in 2020, following the increase in stigmatizing language in conservative outlets. So on March 8th here on the little picture, there was an increase of 650% of Twitter retweets saying China virus and like terms. The next day, there was an increase of 800% increase in the news conservative media articles. So in the 3 weeks after March, the levels of implicit bias against Asians increased enough to offset more than 3 years of prior declines. So it was going well, but then boom, reverse. This research provides evidence that the use of stigmatizing language increased subconscious beliefs that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. And remember, during this period, that's when the Atlanta shootings, the 6 Asian spa workers were shot. Words do matter. And media is influential. So question, how do you perceive Asians? So let's pull that poll out, get the poll out and say, how many of you have asked, where are you really from? And this is anonymous, so don't worry about your answer. This is just, it's all good. So no matter why you were asking it, because maybe you want to sit down and have a 2-hour conversation and really get to know that person. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you're categorizing them. But either way, particularly right now, that is not a question to ask because it implies that you don't see them as American. And this video, you may have seen this video. This is out in 2013. I believe it's Ken Tanaka. it has 10 million views. And what kind of Asian are you? And it demonstrates, kind of why that matters. And on this next video, I'm going to play for you a little bit of it. Matt Arfact, he talks about where you really from, and I think this should be used in educational programs. It is brilliant. So let's play this here. Oh, by the way, how many have you asked where you really from? Okay, we have 78% who say no. Well, okay, sure. So let's play this.
What's your heritage?
What are you?
You don't look American.
But where are you really from?
Here we go again with that, where you really from? How many times have I had this same conversation? Probably at least 1,001. Why should I have to tell my whole family history to anyone at all just cause they're dumbfounded by the fact that my face don't match their idea of a typical American? If I were white Caucasian, yeah, I wouldn't go this way, but I'm mixed race Asian, which means when I say I'm American, born and raised in the USA, that they just pause, searching their mind for the words to be able to say.
No way, but you can't. I'm gonna refuse to believe it. I mean, an American is Asian. I just can't conceive it. You know, it just doesn't seem quite right. You must be mistaken because American means white, except that it doesn't.
Oh, he's so talented. I just can't wait. I tried to get him on. Oops. I wanted to get him on SNL and other places. So I also got his backstory and talked about his heritage and how he identifies he's Korean and white, and inspiration of some of these songs. And so I'll send an email out for those of you who have your emails from Evite. If not, send me an email, Jolene@jolenejang.com, and I'll share references to these things I'm talking about. So did you see this in the news? A few weeks ago, Taylor Greene referred to Asian Americans as yellow people. So what she doesn't understand is that Asian Americans find that term offensive, and it contributes to reinforcing the stereotype of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners. So just to bring this back, remember we talked about in the historic history, yellow peril, yellow terror, yellow belly, which is the coward, yellow journalism, which is exaggerated. And in China, yellow movies are pornography. So let's talk about how let's talk about yellowface and how TVs and movies perpetuate stereotypes.
For a solid 2 decades, the Chinese detective character Charlie Chan was played by white men in makeup. But that was the 30s and 40s, right? Well, here's Jim Sturgis and Hugo Weaving reincarnated as Koreans for parts of Cloud Atlas.
Who are you?
Everyone remembers Mickey Rooney's infamous 1961 performance in Breakfast at Tiffany's as just fully unacceptable and racist, right? Well,
Yes. So, aren't you surprised? Like, I thought that yellowface was inappropriate, like blackface. But no, blackface is inappropriate, but yellowface still okay. So here is an example of...
For a solid 2 decades, the Chinese detective character Charlie Chan was played...
I just pulled up some of the latest movies from, 2007 to 2017 that have yellowface. And another term is called whitewashing.
Arguably worse than white people playing Asian characters is white people playing real-life Asian humans, which is what happened to Cora Lijek in Argo, and to Jeffrey Ma, who appeared in the movie 21 as this character, even though in real life he was this guy.
Ben Campbell was the most gifted student at MIT.
It's not surprising that directors want to hire big names to attract producers and funding, but when they want to do stories about Asians and won't cast Asian actors, they should know that the blowback against that has been building for the better part of a century.
So whitewashing, Asian Americans are seen as foreigners. So when there's a real story about a real Asian, they rob them and take their story away and replace it with a white character. That's maddening. In media in Hollywood do such a great job with this. The other stereotype is the model minority myth. And in 1966, the New York Times article was pitting Japanese Americans against Black Americans, stereotyping Japanese Americans as a successful, industrious, exceptionally law-abiding, while portraying Black Americans as part of the problem minority group. unable to overcome histories of discrimination. When the Japanese were incarcerated, they got over it. Why can't them? So many people say, well, what's the problem? The stereotypes of Asians are positive. It's smart, it's math, it's obedient. But I'll share with you why it's harmful. It masks the disparities. Remember that there are 48 countries. And for example, when we look at this, well, let's look at income. So yes, Asians make the most, like the Indians make the most, but then the Burmese make the least. So it is the biggest income gap. And so if you're thinking, oh, crazy rich Asians, yes, but what about the other ones who are refugees and had to start at the bottom, and so they don't get their services? There are many problems with that. And for example, in New York, 1 in 4 Chinese are under the poverty line. And there is also pressure to meet expectations. So I interviewed, there was 15 teenagers, female teenagers from the East Coast. And it was a really good interview. And they talked about the pressures. They were not accepted. They felt ugly, etc. And they also had pressure to be the smart person. And people wanted to, they wanted to cheat from them. They wanted to like, oh, you're smart, right? And, they already feel like an outsider. And so they have all these pressures to meet expectations. It's really sad. And Asian American college students have high levels of, Asian ones have high levels of suicide attempts. So there are many problems with this. And then just to speak to, Asian Americans are promoted less. Because they're seen as quiet and obedient, they're not seen as leaders, and that's called the bamboo ceiling. So media has been perpetuating negative stereotypes for a long time, but there is some bright hope there. There's these little gems that happen maybe once a month or so. Sesame Street. So the first time, I think it was in 50 years, there's some really good podcasts about this, that they introduce an Asian. So this is a Korean character by a Korean puppeteer. And they launched it on Thanksgiving, and it's such a good, it's so good. I encourage you to watch it. But there's also backlash. The president of CPAC called to defund PBS for introducing an Asian character. Why you gotta talk about race? So there's that. So PBS is promoting diversity because that is the new trend. And in 2045, white people will no longer be the majority in America. Smart companies are positioning themselves to gain from this polycultural market. So you should too, right? There are many companies that are starting to do this. Twitter, Airbnb, some of the progressive ones. So what can you do to position yourself? Well, you certainly need to create this welcoming environment. You need this Asian American component to add to your DEI program. So your program should make sure to increase self-awareness of unconscious bias, like we talked about, recognize and stop microaggressions, encourage and foster empathy and allyship, and celebrate diversity. It is, we don't have time to talk about that, but it's really fascinating and very fun. So to be effective, this is not a one-day checkbox, hey, I did it. Asian inclusivity should be integrated into policies and procedures. It should, at the city of Seattle, for example, each department has a diversity committee. So decisions are ran through this diverse group to look for problems before they make the decision. Inclusivity should really be threaded through all the aspects of the business until it becomes the culture. It's like, oh, it's what we do. That's who we are. It's part of the brand, not one and done. So when you design your Asian cultural training, it's important to have somebody who has some firsthand experience, because when you're talking about race, teaching from books is not the same as lived experience. When I consult with organizations, I share how to set up programs that will be lasting and embedded in your culture. So of course, standard programs like assessments, cultural history, customs, nonverbal communication, blah, blah, blah. But I also introduce people to frameworks for understanding and appreciating cultural differences. You may have heard of shame and pride cultures versus guilt and justice, high context versus low context, collectivism and individualism. Because Asia includes 48 countries, It's a big group, but if you can start to have some frameworks to try and bucket a few of them to be able to look at it. So we start there. And the point is really, I teach people the value of different perspectives and to be able to process and reflect before reacting and to see the differences as advantages. There's an interview I did with another mixed guy who is an actor. And there was a moment in there where he talks about seeing the advantages. He always was made fun of, et cetera. But then he saw Jason Momoa and a couple of like Asian stars. He's younger than me, to like, oh, it's an advantage being mixed. Oh, it's an advantage. So learn to shift that mindset. A couple of skills I focus on is reducing stress and anxiety that accompanies interacting with individuals from other cultures, because that's a barrier to communication. So we want to remove those barriers. For example, if we assume that, let's say, emotion from people from Far East, that they're lacking emotion, well, I explain how Asian expressions of emotions differ from others. Something as simple as eye contact. Particularly, Koreans and Japanese. And let's say hugging, for example. So all my friends are huggers, but unless you're a hot dude, like, I don't really need to hug you. I just, so it could be misinterpreted that I don't like them. No, I just don't really do hugs. It's not, I didn't grow up with a bunch of touchy-feely and definitely no PDA. It's just not part of my culture. And I'm fourth generation, so I've been here a while. Another example is if you're in Texas and your market analysis says, hey, you know what, there's a large Vietnamese population and we have products and services for them, then we would tailor your training to meet the needs of that market, which is going to be very different than marketing to Hmong in Wisconsin. Because you got to remember, Asians are not all alike. Here's something simple you can do today to show respect to your Asian employees or clients, or maybe a way to show, like, to a new client. Pronounce their name correctly. When they say, oh, just call me Amy, make an effort to say, you know what? If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to try and say your name. If you can share with me how to say that, because it's part of our identity. And again, when I interviewed these teenagers, yes, part of their name. And there are a number of episodes about saying your name correctly. So if you can take the time to do it, make the effort, it makes a big difference. When I was in South Africa, I couldn't pronounce his name, and I didn't understand it or anything, so this is what I did. And what is your name?
Golan.
Do it again?
Golan. Golan.
Oh, do it again. Let's look at your mouth.
Simple. Golan. Golan.
So the idea is, make the effort and ask permission. Can I record you saying your name? Is that okay? I mean, here, you have to be like me, but like, can I see your lips? But, and after practicing over a month or so, many times, it's Sutu and Kolani. So it's you have to click. And I was a percussionist, so maybe, and I do know Dougie Fresh, so maybe something happened. But practice, show that you're making the effort, even if it doesn't sound at all like what it's supposed to. You are showing that effort. And they may say, no, thanks, but just call me Amy. So just little things like that make a difference. And let's talk about food for a moment. And what is your name? I was so pleased with myself for making this meal. But why would you not want to serve this, let's say, to a Japanese audience? Or to a Chinese audience. Well, the problem is this is mixed. And my Ethiopian friend was here, and I'm like, you know what? I better make sure to explain what is what, because I don't want to miseducate, because we have miso soup in the corner, which is Japanese. We have kimchi, which is Korean. We have seaweed salad, which is Japanese, and the dumplings that are Chinese. And then the pickled ginger is Japanese, and then the Korean bean sprouts. And if you want to look like you know something and you've taken the time, then learn something as simple as food, because otherwise it looks like, oh, they don't know what they're doing. And please do not miseducate your non-Asian audiences. When I see Korean teriyaki, it makes me so mad. So anyways, there's that. So ongoing, at your company, we could also do creative things like this where we work with food. Ongoing learning can be monthly, weekly, Zoom discussions, exercises, challenges, Ask an Asian. And I also set up listening sessions. Being inclusive isn't just gaining knowledge. It's about acting on the knowledge. It's taking a risk, making mistakes, and doing it again, and creating a safe place for people to make mistakes. And I can also help you set this up. What I've done, and I'm not on the screen, what I've done is I've set up 2 groups. So this is Empowered Asians. I was finding that there was no place for Asians to talk. Just to, we have to code switch all the time. Like, oh, I don't want my white friend to feel bad, or she gets stressed if I said this, so I just say nothing. And so there's a big need for this. So I particularly in the workplace, and I've also set up Asian Allies, and this is a place where you can practice. It's non-Asians. I mean, Asians are allowed too, but it's really a safe place to make mistakes where we can learn. Because if you're afraid to make a mistake, you're just not helpful. So, and what we do in these groups is we can discuss things like this, like that are timely and relevant. During the Olympics, we talked about this collective collection, Barbie collection. And so it's like 4 white girls and a black woman with, kind of like white hair, black, it's just like, how is this inclusive? And in Tokyo. And just the other night at our weekly meeting, we talked about the Very Asian hashtag and how that came out. So again, learning about any kind of culture, particularly Asian culture, it's ongoing. It has to be embedded, and it can be really fun. So, oh yes, I'm saying this. Yeah, fun, because I was a fun specialist. I think I'm still fun here and there. And I think when it is fun and we do these competitions and interactions, then people can remember it more. So before I conclude, and before our Q&A or discussion, John, I really want to thank you for setting this up, and with also Tyler from Meetings Today for promoting this, and API Profs. And also, John is very skilled with producing meetings. He's the Zoom jockey, but like high level. And so when I conclude, he's going to share with us just a little bit of what he does to make this magic happen. So at the start of the program, I asked a question. And that question was, yeah, aren't Asians all alike? By now, you better know the answer. The answer is no. And really, we've only scratched the surface of how diverse we are. There are 23 million Asian Americans. So you have the countries of origins, you have the generations of Americans. Again, like I'm 4th generation, there are 6th generation, there's mixed, there's adoptees. By the way, on Netflix, there is a documentary called Found that talk about these Chinese adoptees. And also with the different generations, the Far East, Deep South, Larissa Lam, she put it's award-winning documentary together about her husband's family from Mississippi, and talks about the Chinese and Black friendship over the generations in the 1800s. So learn about Asian cultures. It really is enriching. And I think it's a conversation starter as well. And remember, what you don't know could cost you. You may not know that your employees or you are using microaggressions, and you don't know that they're offensive, and it could cost you, your customers, and perhaps a lawsuit. And you may not know that your workplace is unsafe for Asians. And you also may not know that you're interpreting your Asian client's body language. So, but you do know now is the financial benefit of appealing to the Asian market.
Thank you so much, Jolene Jang, right? Are all Asians alike? No, we're talking about 48 countries, over 100 dialects. And actually, as you dive into it, you'll see how much even rich diversity inside of here. Again, I'm John Chen here. It's API, Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And again, thank you to Jolene for that enlightening presentation. We got a lot of wows in the chat, like things like, if you don't know some of these numbers, you don't know that they're true. And again, I think some other people here were chatting here. Thanks again, Colleen, and some of the others who are joining us in our live audience about talking about that they didn't know some of these items and also what a big burden some of them really are. So I'm excited to bring these next two people. They're going to talk about Asian mental health. And I actually just recently took a trip to LA, and I was actually starting to notice this because, one, I haven't traveled a lot lately, and two was I did not know what it was going to be like to either be Asian and or wearing a mask in LA. And again, I'm from Stockton, California, so I think I know California, but there is this part, even if nothing happens, and thank goodness for me on my trip, nothing happened, there is this toll. And the toll is the things that you have to think about in your background. Right? About, will something happen? Could something happen? And I did notice that a lot on this trip. So they're going to share, as both they're Asian women and Asian psychologists, they're going to share some stories about their upbringing, statistics about anti-Asian racism, and most importantly, the mental health aspects of racism and our social justice work to make a difference. I'm excited to bring in the two Ginas. Let's bring in Gina Wong and Gina Ko.
Hi, John. Thank you for having us.
There we go. I've got the two Ginas in the house.
So it is funny that we both go by Gina. And in fact, we're both married to Toms. That's kind of our little joke. Yeah, we have a lot of commonality, and Gina are very good friends, and of course psychologists. So I will introduce myself. First, I just want to say that I go by the pronouns she and her. And I am a professor at Athabasca University in Canada and also a psychologist. I'm also the founder and ambassador of the Asian Gold Ribbon Campaign, which I'll talk a little bit about later on in our presentation. I want to first share a land acknowledgement. It's really important to Gina and I that we respectfully acknowledge the traditional lands that we both live and work on in Alberta, Canada. Gina is in Territory 7, I'm in Territory 6, home of the Inuit peoples. And it's very important to us to honor and respect, the Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have walked upon these lands a long time before us. So I will hand it over to Gina to start with her intro and sharing her story.
Thank you, Gina. This is so fun. Gina squared. Well, I am also a psychologist in Alberta, Canada. I'm a counselor educator, so I teach for several Master of Counseling programs here in Alberta. And I'm a podcast host, which I'm going to talk about my podcast later, Against the Tides of Racism. 38 episodes so far, and we'll leave that till the end. So yes, my story, I'd be remiss to not just quickly share how Gina and I met. Actually, we met in 2011. Gina was actually my professor at the time, and she became my thesis supervisor. And now we became great colleagues, great friends, and we're doing amazing things together. So I just want to make sure I say that before we continue on here. I came to Canada in 1979 from Malaysia. But it was actually from Vietnam that we escaped Vietnam in 1979 in a boat. So I identify as Chinese Canadian with some Vietnamese roots. So we were in a refugee camp for about 6 months, and then the Canadian government was generous enough to take us in. So Regina and then Calgary. So growing up, I actually struggled through school. I didn't speak any English until I was about 5 years old. First day of kindergarten was absolutely very terrifying. My first language is Cantonese. One thing that's very special to me and dear to my heart is that I am a language broker. If you're not familiar with what a language broker is someone who does translation, interpretation at a young age for family members. So I was raised by a single mom, aunties and uncles, and grandmas. So as a language broker, some of the experiences that I've encountered was when I was like 5 or 6. People maybe at the mall or doctor's office, or even buying a car, helping my auntie and uncle. They didn't really want to talk to a child, right? So those moments are really tough. I felt, now that I look back, now that I'm an adult, I dismissed, and there were even some outright, we can't help you. As I was getting older, I became a teenager, they would look at me talking rather than my aunties and uncles. So the discrimination, the racism is real, right? So I became a school teacher, graduated in 2000, became a school teacher. I taught in the First Nations community. I also taught in the Calgary Board of Education. And then when my children were a little young, about 1 and 3, I went back to school. I started my graduate program. So now I'm a psychologist. I do work with lots of Asian and racialized clients. So privileged to hear their stories, to hear them share, how come I'm reaching out to a therapist? It's about work stress. It's about relationships. It's about racism. It's about many, many, many other topics. So I see individuals, couples, and families. The young people are amazing. I learned so much from them and their strengths. So, and then as a counselor educator, again, from my graduate students, they bring so much to my work world. I'm very lucky. I decided to go back to school in 2010, and I met Gina, and here I am today and talking to everyone. So that's me in a nutshell. I'll pass it on to Gina.
Thanks, Gina. And I also want to thank John for asking folks to put in the chat where you're from, what your culture is. It's great for us, for Gina and I, to get a sense of who's in the audience. Also, very importantly, we are talking about anti-Asian racism, but there is racism in all forms that are occurring around the world. And it's so important to us, and I think to the world, to have cross-racial coalitions. And so when we were speaking about, race-based trauma, I think it goes for many, many other cultures. Of course, there are some distinctions, but we want to make sure that we're acknowledging all other ethnicities and cultures. So a little bit about myself. I am actually not one who speaks out a lot, and it's interesting because that has changed over the last year, and I'm still kind of working on it. So for me, what happened last year, I started getting involved with doing some interviews, and it was around the time of, hi Jenny, it was around the time that the Atlanta shootings happened. And so I was being interviewed, and there were questions about my own experiences of racism growing up. And I found myself talking to a very national audience about experiences that I had not uttered out loud before. So it was very interesting to me just to hear myself articulated, and then kind of in the interview and feel what I felt. And what I talked about were my experiences where growing up as a little girl in Montreal, Canada, and being one of the few, if not the only, Asian family in the community. Every day after school, pretty much, kids would kick and chase me and spit on me, shout racial slurs, pull at their eyes to imitate my Chinese eyes. And I remember those experiences and not understanding what was happening and what was wrong with me, that those children would do that. And it became, what Gina and I will talk about later, internalized racism, where I believed that something was wrong with me because I had no way of understanding it. I didn't tell anybody what was happening to me because of the shame. And, that has had long-standing, profound impacts on my life. And, I think some of the ways that manifests is, perfectionism and trying to get reinforcement or other people supporting my worth based on what I do or how much I please them. And so, I've done a lot of work over the last few years of, being an anti-pleaser and learning to live with people not liking me, and all those things. But that's just one kind of offshoot, and it didn't end when I was just, grade 1. It was kind of throughout my life. And I do remember as an adolescent, some of the boys, the way that they would behave around me and what they would say. And I particularly remember that they would sing the song, My Little China Girl, the David Bowie song. And I remember thinking how distinct that was from my early experiences where I was shunned and spit on. Suddenly these boys were singing at me. And I thought, oh, that's really nice. And so I sort of took that as a compliment, but it was very confusing because it was clearly not said in a way that was complimentary. And later on in life, when I read what the verses of that song really were about, it was about, communism and, the fear of Chinese taking over, and, not at all very positive things at all to be singing to somebody. You know, right up to present day, I've experienced racism, doing presentations, being out in public. So it's certainly not anything that Gina and I don't experience. And I think it's important for us to anchor our conversation around the experiences that we've had, some of the race-based trauma we've experienced, the way it's impacted, you know, my life, my family. And yeah, so wanted to share that, and hopefully, you know, we'll have an opportunity at the end to hear as well from some of our participants. So I want to share some of the statistics with you before we go any further. And on our website, asiangoldribbon.com, we have some of the facts about anti-Asian racism. And as you can see, the numbers counting up in Canada, what's happening right now. In 2021, there was a 301% increase in anti-Asian racism reports in Canada. And from 2021, from 2020, we have 943 reports of anti-Asian racism. And you can see that women are the most affected. The perpetrators were found to be around 75% white male perpetrators. And as you can see also the increase, significant increase from 2021, from 2020, 286% of our children and youth are reporting acts of anti-Asian racism pitted against them. That, you know, that just gets at, you know, makes my stomach turn, in fact, to hear that and what's happening for our youth. You can also see an increase of attacks, you know, where they happen, public spaces, you know, and the amount of distress that people are reporting, 71%. So do feel free to visit our website. We have these statistics that are shown, you know, marketable increase as well for transgender and gender non-conforming Asians. And so, you know, there's a lot that is happening. And Gina and I were part of a rally on Sunday, and it was, you know, some photos were posted on Twitter, and it is amazing what people will still say and not believe that anti-Asian racism is still happening, or that, yeah, it's happening, but, you know, why is that an issue? So it's, you know, it's really upsetting to hear and know that people are not educated, or they just don't want to understand the impact on everybody. So as we scroll through, a lot of, you know, the other statistics you can see showing up here, how many are affected. We also have Australia's statistics as well. So you can see that on our website. Really, anti-Asian racism is a public health emergency. Since the pandemic began, Asian people have been experiencing record amounts of denigration, hate, and racism. So in that, you know, talking about the different racist tropes and mental health impacts, they are huge, and I think many of you will identify with them.
Thanks, Gina. As this is a good segue into talking about, I'm just going to introduce this, you know, the terms racial trauma and race-based trauma, you know, in terms of experiences of discrimination, microaggressions, overt racism, workplace, you know, harassment and bullying. Those just are some of the few examples. And with racial trauma, it can cause chronic stress, anxiety, depression, low self-worth, you know, someone being very hard on themselves, overall mental health well-being goes down. So Jolene did a really good job explaining some of these terms that I'm going to introduce. So I'm not going to go into details, but one of the model minority myth, you know, and Jolene explained it, you know, in a way where, you know, Asians are seen to be like hardworking, right? And we put our heads down, and I'm going to introduce some Cantonese words here, like, you know, like to tolerate yan, you know, just take it in, right? And kowtow, like put our heads down, right? So a part of the problem with such a myth is that, you know, it's, again, it seems like it's, oh, it's great, you know, you're doing well, you're hardworking, but as Jolene said, there's such disparity, right, between, you know, different Asian populations. And then, and again, Jolene talked about the bamboo ceiling already.
Can I just add to the model minority?
Yes, Gina.
And that it was actually created to pit Asians against Black community.
Yeah.
And that the model minority the idea that we have upward mobility as long as we work hard enough and have education really does a disservice. And there's a hugest gap, economic gap in Asian populations between those low wage earners and high wage earners. And the model minority fails to see, I mean, the diversity of our people, but also really disadvantaging those at the lower end who are supposed to be working hard enough to get where they need to be, which is, does a huge disservice to us.
As you say that, Gina, there's a term called sticky floors, right? Sticky floors where, people, mostly are women, racialized women who are maybe in a position where they're not able to upwardly move up in an organization. Could be due to many factors. It could be systemic. It could be, how they're oppressed and disadvantaged, and they stay there. They stay there all their lives, right? So they're more assistants, like assisting, certain roles in the company. And then the bamboo ceiling is, which Jolene talked about, it's a real where, and again, there's statistics showing that there's a lot of Asians, especially Asian women, earning PhDs. However, how many Asian women actually have full-time tenure track positions? Gina, Dr. Wong here does, right? But it's not very many, right? So there's that bamboo ceiling, and Asians in general are not seen as leaders and, well-spoken, outgoing, right? So that these terms are troubling, and we need to trouble them. We need to unpack. So, and Gina, I would.
I was just going to say the bamboo
Yes.
ceiling, I feel it so,
Yeah.
deeply entrenched in the systems. When I was program chair of my department, I could feel how difficult it was for people to hear me versus the white male program chair or deans. And so it's this constant, going against the grain almost in how people perceive us, the voice that they will allow us to have. And I know firsthand the detriment that has, as well as, what makes us stay in leadership positions when it's very hard. So it's a big one.
Well, can I share a quick personal story? So Gina, as program chair, you were also my mentor, right? And you would say to me, I'm so proud of you, Gina. You spoke up there. You used your voice, and, you shared an opinion, and you encouraged me. You encouraged me to continue on to believe in, I have something to say. I have something to share, and it is worthwhile and it's important. So Gina, I want to go back to your story earlier about, the boys and the what's your experience when you were younger. Can you talk about eroticization and sexualization of Asian women?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of history around that. Asian women used what's called comfort women for the, World War soldiers, and just this ornamentalism of Asian women. The fact that, we're seen as this eroticized race. There's lots of, things that we'll value in a culture that is also hypersexualized to begin with. So it's a perception of objectifying and seeing women in this kind of token way, that they're there for male pleasure. And so that, has a lot of disadvantage. And I know a lot of, clients and people that I know, Asian women who have had, traumatic experiences of sexual assault, and just the intimation of, and words that are very, can be very scary and frightening. That's a long-standing history, and there's representation of that as well in the media, as well as in film. So it's a pervasive racist trope as well.
I actually heard a program, and I can't name it now, about the music videos, about they were asking, how these young Asian women, how come you took these roles? And they would say, well, if we don't take these, they would have nothing. They would have not be able to, to work, and they like to dance, right? So yeah, absolutely. And that question in itself, it's almost like blaming the woman who decided to say, yes, I will do that, right? So it's a big problem.
Yes.
And I would like you to also, I think we talked a little bit about barriers to seek help and the stigmatization of mental health. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yes. So I wrote an article about this in the conversation, and talked about how Asian people are really disproportionately served when it comes to mental health supports. Asians are, as found in research, the least likely to seek help. And I think that has a lot to do with the model minority stereotype, as well as some cultural beliefs. And what was found that there really is a shortage of language-specific, culturally appropriate, sexually affirming mental health services for Asian people. And, along those lines, I think that, the youth is really where we're trying to aim at and talking about the destigmatization of mental illness and to talk about it openly. I think we don't have a choice right now during the pandemic. Most of us are suffering to some degree from the pandemic in a mental health capacity. So I think that the language, the knowledge of that has to be and is there now. But I think with Asians, it is intimidating and it can be very stigmatizing. So, work on trying to destigmatize that and to recognize what those barriers are. And it's often found that Asian individuals will seek therapy and mental health supports when it's at a crisis mode. And, that's very, that's very alarming because, of course, help earlier would be so much better. And we are seeing increases mental health, coping in terms of drug and alcohol use, their suicidality, among the many, many other effects. The increase in cortisol level with race-based traumatic stress has an impact on the body and mental health in ways, we're just starting to discover. So there's, a long longevity of what this kind of stress does and the barriers in seeking help.
Mm-hmm. And Gina, as you're saying that, I'm recalling my PhD research. I work with several racialized youth, and they all identify as female. And they said, Gina, physical health, mental health should be just as important as physical health. Why can we not talk about mental health? Why is it so stigmatized, right? And a part of it is that it is for racialized people, there's a research showing that they don't believe that, these professionals can help me, that they can get me, they can understand my story. And a few terms that I'm going to introduce: cultural humility and cultural sensitivity, which Gina and I both use to teach in our graduate programs, where it's really important to be humble, to be aware of our own biases, what we don't know, what are we assuming about the people around us, the people we work with, and then also to be humble and ask if we don't know, rather than make assumptions and run with it. So that's the small part of how it can be so helpful for people to experience that type of therapy and to come back to seek more. So
when it comes to race-based traumatic stress, they do say in the literature that positive ethnic identity buffers the effects and support from family and friends. And also, I love Jolene's presentation because she really gave a thorough kind of history lesson in terms of, Chinese, East Asians coming to Canada, building the railway, and understanding that from a place of, I have to talk about when we can story our past and have an integrated memory or thought about what happened to us. And these are long line generations of thoughts, but they live through and perpetuate through the generational line. So how important that is to be instilling positive ethnic identity. And I think, things that, Seattle is doing with API celebration and what we're trying to do during this month and throughout the year is really important to foster that.
Mm-hmm. So next, we're going to turn to our next attention to some of the specific themes of mental health impacts and what we are experience and witness in a personal and professional practice. So Gina, do you want to start with talking about, like, for example, struggles at work?
Well, I was actually going to start with talking about perfectionism since
okay, you can start with that.
What I started out with. Yeah. But I would say far and wide themes that that in my clinical practice and my own life and, other individuals that I know who have had experience of racism, sets at a core level a feeling of unworthiness, a sense of not being good enough. And as I mentioned earlier, slow hits of that worthiness can come when people approve of us, give praise, reinforce the good work that we're doing, and which is nice, but it's actually valuing people based on what they do. So performance-based worthiness. And that's very dangerous. We all know this because, of course, in life, we're going to have criticism. We're not going to do something. We're going to make mistakes once in a while. And what that does is it just, basically a sense of self-worth plummets when it's naturally based on performance. So, my own work in my life and my work with clients and other individuals is to shift to worthiness based on a being. That's who we are, not what we do, but who we are and what we offer. And, there's lots around that, but, I've created a model called Tree of Life, Leadership and Legacy that has to do with these principles. So I wanted to start off with the theme of perfectionism.
Mm-hmm. And Gina, I'm going to actually, as you're talking about the self-worth and doing versus being. I have children. My children are, so does Gina. My children are 13 and 16, and we consistently talk about the growth mindset, right? And the experience of learning. What am I learning? What am I unlearning? Outcome based, looking at achievement only, looking at grades, it can be very dangerous. It could be exactly what Gina said. It can be so defining and it can be so hard on an individual. So I'm going to go back to, actually, I'm going to talk about the struggles at work. So for example, some of the themes are that, I am struggling at work. Maybe it's me. Maybe I don't really know what I'm doing. My voice, the voicelessness, my voice doesn't seem to matter, I feel that I question myself. I try to speak out. And I know my stuff, but when people aren't listening, then I turn inwards, right? So some of the moments I would pause and talk about, how do we cultivate unconditional self-worth? How do we cultivate self-compassion and self-validation? And you hear the word self, right? It sounds kind of unfair, hey, like, how do we self? So a part of, some of these in psychology is called interventions or strategies. It's not just those moments, but those moments do help. Going back to, exploring younger years, and sometimes hearing that it's hard to talk about emotions, not having learned how, So even in our practice, and I'm sure Gina, you too, some of the things we have heard is that this is one of the first times we're talking about feelings and emotions, and it's hard, but it's so important. And it's so crucial to share with someone who there's a sense of safety and trust.
Yeah. I love what Jenny said in the chat, where, burnout is the natural outcrop of what happens when it's performance-based worthiness. And, I talk to my daughters about this too, new at their jobs and, given a lot of tasks, and they, of course, do their best to do it, but it's not realistic. And when we continue to do that, it seems as if we can have a large volume of work continue to come at us, and it's hard to create those barriers and know when to stop. Before you know it, you're working, both ends of the candle, and burnout is, quick reality. I'm guilty of that myself, as I know you are too, Gina. But it's that sense of, can't let people down. But I was also going to say, I think a piece of it that I've come to understand, Gina, is that, that emphasis on marks growing up was also our parents. My parents were immigrants trying to do their best for us in knowing, what success means in being in Canada and United States. It means doing good and, getting those jobs. So it's, it's in this way that they're doing their best to try to cultivate success and living better lives than they did. So I, always try to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. Yes. There's there's that danger of a single story, right? It's not only, this is the only story. There's so many layers and so many perspectives. Gina, as we're talking about, let me see. Oh, yes. Feeling invisible. So there's something called invisibilization, feeling invisible and powerlessness, right? In the workplace, in society, sometimes in relationships. So it's so, crucial that, in those moments we draw from something called dominant narratives. Like what are women supposed to do? What are women, Asian women, what are we supposed to be? Like sometimes we're supposed to be submissive and erotic and quiet, right? So some of those are the themes that are explored in therapy as well. And how do we how do we unpack some of those when we growing up? These are the things we've heard, and then the Burnout. So Jenny, I really liked that you point out burnout, because some of the things that I have introduced is learning to say no or not yet. So no meaning, so boundaries, right? So just because someone thinks, oh, we are very skilled and we can take on loads of work, but it has to stop somewhere, and it can be small. It could be saying no to even in our personal lives. Maybe I don't feel like going out right now. I'm going to say no to that. Maybe I'm going to say not yet to a certain smaller project at work, but it doesn't mean, that we can't do it or we're less than,
I want to add to that, Gina, because one of the things that I'm practicing and have had some good mentors around it is actually asking about rates for presenting and doing racial justice work, because it's done on the backs of racialized individuals. We're doing this community service work for free. And I think it's, about time we start asking, in terms of, is there some pay? And that to me is also a boundary setting, because I talked to some of my colleagues who are from Black communities, and they're exhausted. Black History Month, it was just exhausting, and they, can't do it anymore. It needs to be our allies who are speaking out, and not just us, that this work is on the backs of. So, I'm finding that that's important too, that we value our own time, and that we let others know that we are valuing our own time in addition.
Mm-hmm. And a part of that is that self-love, self-compassion piece, right? To prioritize ourselves. As you're right, Gina, if we don't, then we wouldn't be available. We wouldn't be able to do our great work, right? So I love what you said about asking and for a stipend or some kind of some kind of acknowledgement. This is important work.
Mm-hmm. You're going to laugh at me too, Gina, because, I've worked a long time over the years in gaining voice, especially as a faculty member. And I found, when you're talking about invisibilizing, that I would sort of summon up the courage to say a really good point that I had, and, at the point when it was appropriate, which, takes a lot for me, who didn't speak up a lot because of growing up. I wanted to be invisible because I didn't want to be the target of other people's hate. And so, I would learn, and I would put out my point, but I wouldn't follow it up. I wouldn't continue the conversation or keep persisting if people weren't hearing it. So, I find in my own growth and development as a professional that it's continuous, it's never ending. And, now I can make a point, I can follow the point, I can track it, I can bring it around. And, that has taken me many, many years to do. And it also depends on what setting. So, I'm thinking many can relate to that, because, okay, I've said it, but then, maybe not John, because he's an extrovert. So, he's probably right there, able to say many, many things. I do want to speak one, since we've been talking about themes. I think we're talking now in terms of what's helpful. Mm-hmm. And in my own practice and in this model of tree life, leadership, and legacy, it really begins with our own relationship with ourselves. Because if we are looking for external validation, we can get it in these sort of hits of, performing well. But it's really when we can work within ourselves and find that worthiness and sense of self, and knowing our own person, and that we make mistakes. I think that that's when what feedback we get from others can matter less, or a little bit less. Of course, we're always interrelational. And so that's the work. And it's also the work to work through some of those traumas and what's happened from a trauma-informed lens. But as I've been reading some of Sean Ginwright's work, who is a Black leader, he talks about trauma-informed counseling or trauma-informed therapy approaches, or approaches in general. I know hospitals talk about having a trauma-informed approach, but it's really from the perspective of what happened to you. Like, you are kind of like the worst thing that happened to you. Like, what's your trauma? And that's what you're wearing, what you're trying to take off and not wear anymore. And what I love about Ginwright's work is he talks about healing-centered engagement. And that's more along the lines of the question, what's right with you? Things may have happened, but how does that integrate into a holistic sense of who you are, how you've healed from that. I know from many of my adverse experiences in life, I can say that I grew stronger. And some, you know, I don't have to grow stronger. That's just part of who I am and part of my being. But it's a very holistic, it involves culture, spiritual, civic action, and also collective healing. So, you know, in my work, I talk more about this healing-centered engagement rather than trauma-informed, which really centers the person and their narrative based on what's wrong with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Gina, for introducing. This is new to me too. I'm thinking about like a strengths-based approach, right? To instead of what's wrong, what are times when things are going well, and how did you do that? How did you navigate, manage those moments when it was so difficult, right? And sometimes it's interesting where, you know, I get something like, I've never thought about that, Gina. That's a really good question. Right? When someone is deep in kind of the problem story, you know, which is very valid, absolutely. How do we, again, you know, start to help shifting the mindset and the experiences, and look at resilience and resistance and exceptions and strengths, right? Mm-hmm.
So with all that, Gina, I know that you've done some amazing social advocacy, social justice work. I'd love to hear, you know, how you got into that and what it is.
Mm-hmm. So it was actually a little over a year ago. It's kind of what you said earlier, Gina, with the Atlanta shootings, the 6 Asian women that were killed, and I was very angry, and I started to think, what more can I do? Right. And I was reading about creative anger. Creative anger was coined by Austin Channing Brown, a Black author. And she talks about her own anger and her own sitting with, her own navigating, and what can I do with it? So she wrote this amazing book. So for me, I knew that I wanted to be a podcast host for a few years. I don't know what it is. I just feel like that I, you know, in session, actually sometimes I hear, oh, Gina, you make a great host. So anyhow, that's what I did. I called up my cousin. He's a website designer. You know, sometime in mid-April, I want to start a podcast. And amazingly, he helped me set up the website. So anyhow, as of today, and I have a really amazing audio editor too. My children help. My daughter designed the logo actually against the tides of racism. So you can find me against. Oh, thank you so much, John. You can find me at the website there. 38 guests so far. And I want to just tell you a snippet of what I've learned. I could take days telling you what I've learned from my guests. A few things. Racism as verb. Racism as verb, because it's not either I am or I'm not racist. So if you're not a racist, then you're an anti-racist. So how are you, what are you doing? How are you behaving? How is it moving beyond performative action? What is a real action you're taking? You know, there's a lot of, you know, in today's world, committees and equity and inclusion, great mission statements. What are you doing? What about the representation and, you know, the people that represent different ethnicities and cultural backgrounds in your company? You know, what are you doing to support, you know, employees who need more of that support? So beyond just talking about it being performative, education is so crucial. You know, as we all know, there's lots of misinformation, disinformation going around about coronavirus, about vaccines. And how do you, when you look at something, you read a news article, go and look at the author, who published it, who is this person, who is this organization, right? And learning about, Jolene talked about how to say someone's name. I mean, that's so crucial. You know, my Cantonese name is Go K Fong. Go K Fong. If I decided to change my name, it would be K Fong Ko. And I'm really actually considering changing my name. So if someone can't pronounce K Fong, well, I mean, it's not hard to pronounce, but it'd be very much appreciated if they asked me, like how Jolene asked. A few other, you know, themes are getting to know people who are from a different cultural background, you know, from yours, right? Being curious and learning about and asking good questions for understanding, not for, oh, I'm hearing this story, I'm going to be interrogative and I'm going to question. Being so mindful of our own assumptions and biases, right? So there's so much. Oh, this is on the screen here. This is actually Gina's daughter, Cassie, Cassie Wong Wiley, and she's going to be my next guest this weekend. So stay tuned. It's on Spotify and it's on my website. I can't
wait to hear it, Gina.
Yeah, I can't wait for you to hear it. We talked about you. So that's my work. And before I hand over to Gina, I'm also the director of mental health for the Asian Gold Ribbon campaign. So Gina is going to talk about AGR right now.
Thank you, Gina. Yeah, your podcast is so inspiring, and it's supported by the Canada Race Relations Foundation and many of our Canadian psychological associations. It's really been inspiring watching how Gina's really taken the lead and taken off with this, and people are asking her to be interviewed. So it's quite impressive. So in terms of the Asian Gold Ribbon campaign, as I said, I'm a professor and psychologist. I really had no idea of grassroots organization, charity organizations. But what happened was when I began to do those interviews last year and started to talk about my own experiences, and I was kind of processing them in a new way for the first time. So what I began to think about was the difference it would have made to me when I was young if there was some kind of visible demonstration of pride in being Asian. To see something that would be celebratory of Asians would have made a huge difference. So I thought about gold ribbons, and I thought about what it would be like to have a day, Asian Gold Ribbon Day, which is May 20th, where people wear gold ribbons. Last year they wore masks with the gold ribbon emblem. So post it all over social media so our youth can see it and participate in it. And it really took off. It was truly incredible. We had our East Asian Youth Summit, and we had individuals join us from 11 countries and 9 provinces. We had the Human Rights Commissioner of Canada and lots of government individuals as our VIP guests listening to our East Asian Youth panel. We also, last year in 6 weeks, had 31.3 million people across 80 countries engage with our campaign, which was just amazing to me. I was also thrust a lot in media, and as I said, it's not my comfort zone, but it was so important to speak out about it, and we could see the need because it took off like it did. We also had the Toronto sign, the CN Tower at Niagara Falls, Princess Gates at the Exhibition Place in Toronto, lit in gold on Asian Gold Ribbon Day. So very, very meaningful. We have, McDonald's Canada who is supporting us, and also Hennessy. So to me, it's just been incredible to witness and watch, but I think it's because of the need to have, this stance, this solidarity against anti-Asian racism, and at the same time celebrating and doing what we can to raise the pride, to amplify, to reset. I talk about a global, global reset and a momentum in raising the pride in being Asian and how important that is. And this year we have a couple of events. We're very happy. We have Catherine Ho, who wrote and sang the Mandarin version of Crazy Rich Asians, who's joining us at our youth summit. She'll be singing her song, and many others who are, incredible Asian public figures. But also, again, we have our Asian youth between the ages of 15 and 18 who'll be sharing their stories. And I think that many of us will be able to relate to them, and then we'll open up for community conversation. And this year on May 20th, Asian Gold Ribbon Day, it is focused on women. As you see, I shared the statistics that women are by far the largest hit and targeted. And those statistics really are just skimming the surface, because we know that many people do not report acts of racism against them. So focusing on women, celebrating Asian women, and really honoring we as Asian women and the intersectionality of us all. So Asian Gold Ribbon Day, we have a women's summit where we're going to be also honoring the lives of Michelle Goh and Christina Yuna, who died simply for the fact of being Asian, very brutally. I'm sure you all know their stories. And so we'll be spending some time to give a tribute to them and their lives. And we have Julie Kim, who's a comedian, and many other public figures who will be joining us. And I just want to say one more thing. We're really proud because this year we can meet in person. So we have a couple of Asian Wolf Ribbon dinner celebrations, restaurant at Hongqing and also a restaurant in Edmonton. So, when it comes to advocacy work, I am pushing my own envelope in terms of what I can do and what I know. Thankfully, with a team of 9 directors and supporters, we're able to continue the momentum and do what we do. And, I'm learning so much as I go and having a lot of fun too, but it's so much a passion and so important because it really was about me not wanting to see my daughters growing up in the same environment. And it was, seeing like it was a revival of, the yellow peril, the idea that Asians are dirty, virus carrying. And, I just couldn't stand to see that for my own kids to live, another generation, a few generations where that was going to be happening. So I will end there and would love to hear your stories, any questions or comments. Gina and I are happy to, and would love to hear from you. We've been kind of prattling on for about 45 minutes here, so it'd be great to share in here or in the chat. I think, John, you might be posting some of the questions.
Welcome to 2022.
I want it.
Where my battery pack runs out of battery right when I need to go on. Okay, great. First off, I want to say thank you for being here and addressing these issues. Thank you, of course, for supporting Jolene's work too. All of these things end up into a package like that. And so we do have a couple pieces here too. So we have somebody who's joining in, Colleen Nussi. You know what, Colleen, I need to help unmute you. Let's try it out. Colleen St. James is joining from Canada. Colleen, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. I know that I think I've seen some chats about what you've been experiencing during these last couple hours. Do you mind if you share?
Yeah, well, first, a big thank you to everybody involved. I'm sure there are many people involved behind the scenes as well. Thank you to Jolene, who let me know about this. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to Gina. And Gina, as a Canadian, I'm so, well, of course, I'm disheartened to hear the stats, but also really, I feel there is a highlight on the US, and sometimes Canadians feel that it's better here, and I know that it's not. And so I just think it's so important to get that information out there because we all need to do the work. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing the website. I'm excited to check out the podcast and learn a lot. So thank you both. Can I ask a quick question? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks. So I appreciated, I know Jolene had said, one thing that we can do right away is really making that effort for names. And I appreciated the share about recording because that is something that is helpful for me to hear it back. So I think I might ask for permission in future to do that when learning someone's name. So thank you, Jolene. And Gina, I apologize because I did have a little bit of internet issues. So perhaps you also gave something, but I just thought I'd ask if there was something that you had as an action item that people could do today.
Go ahead, Gina. Do you want to say something?
Well, you're at the end of every podcast interview that Gina does, she asks for calls to action. So I thought she'd be able to whip that up right away.
Go ahead, Gina. You go ahead. Okay. I'll go quickly. It's really neat. So I teach for a Bachelor of Education program too. And I do this activity with my students, the trusted 8. So write 8 names of people that you trust, right? So that's it. And then we open up the different, it's a table, and the trusted 8 activity is, okay, so what's the gender of this person? What's the educational background? What's the ethnicity? What's the sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. So many of the times my students would be quite surprised, and maybe not surprised, that many of the people that they are close with, that they trust, are very similar to them. So one thing that I can suggest is I think I talked about earlier about getting to know people that with curiosity and asking good questions and being that the cultural humility, wanting to learn someone's story and really wanting to take in what makes them special, unique, and strong. So I think that the trusted aid you can find online, I'm sure, is really, especially if you're a teacher, would be a really good one to do, even with your children or even amongst friends. Right? Have that conversation. How come the people on this list they're so much more similar to me in terms of our background? So that's one.
Oh, Gina, you'll love this. I love the Trusted Eight, and I actually haven't heard of it. There's a diversity trainer here in the LGBTQ community here in Seattle. Lonnie Lasardo does, I think, one of the most powerful exercises, and he authored a book about 10 people who used to be in hate groups. And they actually now are out of those hate groups and helping people that they used to hate. And he found the number one factor that was in common is that somebody made a friend in that group that they used to hate.
So good.
So that's where that Trusted Eight, you look at that Trusted Eight, and if you are missing something in your life, if you look at that list and you are having feelings or something about one of them, it's most likely that one of your Trusted Eight is not in that community. And so I tell people the number one thing you can do is make a friend in one of these cultures so that you can start to learn about it. What about you, Gina Wong?
I love this question, Colleen. You got me thinking. Call to action, as Asian Gold Ribbon campaign really is founded upon trying to develop integrated, accessible, destigmatized mental health services for Asians across Canada. And so in any way that can be supported, we are trying to create task force to speak with government. And I have been speaking with our federal government in this domain. So to, help push that agenda in whatever ways possible, seek help when needed. And again, because I think it all starts with our own relationship with ourselves, I think my call to action would be around, fostering a sense of self-compassion and really working on how we feel about ourselves in whatever capacity that might mean.
I'm going to add a question here, right? You're talking about the stigma of mental health, and especially, I think the stigma in Asian cultures is even bigger than most other cultures. And so I'd love to hear from both of your opinions. What can you do if either one, you're the person who's experiencing the mental health challenges, or two, that you're the person observing somebody who's Asian who's having mental challenges? Because I do think there's many cases that go unnoticed, unwatched, or untreated because of inaction. What do each of you have as best tips for them?
I think it's important when we hope that people will share with us what's happening for them at a deep level. But that's a level of vulnerability that we're hoping that they step into. And I have always found that inviting people into a space of vulnerability is being able to be there myself. So depending on in what context, I may not do this with a client, but I'll share my own experiences of mental health struggles and, what I've been through and treatment and, no sort of, hiding anything that I've experienced. And I think when people hear that, they feel much more normalized in what they're experiencing and are likely to speak out. And, it's just a great, I think, place to stand in opening up and inviting people to share about how they're feeling.
Gina, I love that, being vulnerable. And I'm going to say, adding to that, planting seeds, right? Planting seeds. Sometimes the readiness is not there yet, right? It doesn't mean they're never going to be there. And I just want to talk a little bit about even my own family. And I know they're very proud of me, my aunties and uncles. Sometimes they'll use terms like, in Cantonese, like bang yan, a sick person, or like cheesy, and is like crazy, right? So I will actually pause there and explain how, that those are not the terms used. There's a language to the languaging in some Asian or other languages that can be quite stigmatizing. So I'll take those moments to kind of talk about, what I do, what does it mean to be a psychologist, a therapist? So, and then hopefully that's a small example of maybe planting some seeds where maybe my, the younger generation, or even my aunties and uncles, if they need to see someone, they will reach out, right? And I always say, I see a therapist. We all need to see a therapist. It doesn't. And I was just listening to a short interview on CBC that seeing a therapist is a shortcut to a, thriving, healing life, right? So
I really love what you said. And I think also that we can plant seeds indirectly. So, sometimes it means, suggesting they watch Turning Red, a movie, or, slip them. I don't know what it is. I don't tell my kids, but I do this, in indirect ways. We can impact them. That doesn't feel like this direct confrontation, like, most people don't want to hear that we think they should see a therapist, especially when we are a therapist. But so there might be gentler ways to approach, and, books or, things that they might read that, bring them into that space a little more gently.
Well, I love allyship. We get to talk a lot about allyship. Somebody asked, do you have some donation options for either? I don't know if you're both nonprofits or not.
Yes, the Asian Gold Ribbon Campaign. We are have applied for charity status, but our goal is $100,000 raised for integrated accessible mental health services across Canada, and we are really pushing for that. We think it's so important, and please donate. Or it's really one of our publicists. She gets upset with me because I don't really ask for money. It's like my last thing to do, and maybe, but yeah. So she tells me to push it, and for me, it's really amplifying, and it's visibility. And then I forget this little piece. So thank you for mentioning that, John.
Yeah, Gina Co.
No, mine is funded by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, so I don't take donations. I was paying it, I was using my own money, and then actually the director of CRF said he will fund it, so I wrote a proposal. So no, but thank you for the question, and please, Asian Gold Ribbon, that's where you can donate.
And again, there's plenty of other nonprofits around in every city as well as international that can really help. We're almost out, but I do want to add this part. I would love to hear this part, really kind of end on a high note too. One of our good friends here used to be a newscaster here in Seattle, and now I think she's in Chicago or another city, St. Louis. And she had somebody call into her show because she added a piece about eating dumplings on Korean, Chinese New Year, right? And so you probably saw this, and now she took something that was really bad. I mean, somebody goes in and then talked to her like, "Would you please stop being very Asian?"
Yes.
Right.
We are very Asian. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm very. What are you talking about, right?
Michelle Lee was going to be one of our honored guests in the Women's Summit. She's waiting for her to confirm, but my gosh, has she created a movement?
Yes, so that's what I want to talk about. Those who don't know, right? She took this thing, which is great, right? And she took this bad situation, put a video out, and then it started gaining steam. And now they really have this hashtag Very Asian is trending. They have a lot of clothes or swag that's for sale. And she even got on Ellen and got a big check. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What's something where you have a success story that you can share about, supporting things in the API like heritage culture?
Gina, go ahead.
There's so many. I can just quickly think about even my podcast, all the guests that I would have never met. I would have never heard their stories, where they were so generous in sharing openly with me what they've been through in their lives and the calls to action. I mean, right now I'm being way more brave. If I don't ask, I am not going to get a yes, right? So I ask everybody. If they don't reply to me, then I can ask again. So that's kind of, we just keep having to keep going here and to be resistance and resilience so that's mine.
Well, something I'm really proud of is this year I was awarded the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association Leadership Award.
Oh,
and thank you. And I'm the first racialized person in history to ever receive that award. And so that has great meaning to me. And a couple of days ago, it was recognized by the Human Rights Commissioner of Canada. So Marie-Claude Landry sent a letter just, recognizing that I am the first racialized person to receive this. And, to me, that just, I have no words to express what that means. And, she spoke about how it gives her hope for her children and her grandchildren that, women, racialized people in leadership positions are starting to be recognized. I mean, I don't, Michelle Lee's, claim to fame, that would be wonderful. But, I think it's day to day, doing what we do, following our passions, and, getting some of these awards now and then, of course, helps us let us know we're on the right path.
So let me add this one piece here too, and hopefully the two of you can stay for just a few minutes. I know we will have a chat after we end live stream. I want to close with this piece here. Recently, the Northwest Asian Weekly, which has the editor Asunta Ng, who's a big advocate here in the Northwest, they've been running a Black and Asian Alliance program. And over the last year, in the last voting cycle here in Seattle, I believe over 82 Black and Asian officials were voted or appointed into office. So I think that's another cool marker about making progress with that. And I want to end on this high note. You know, I really want to just give a shout out to my grandfather who came here. He was a paper son. And for those who don't know what a paper son is that Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 started preventing Chinese people from coming in the country, which Jolene talked about because they're like, oh, the railroad's done and now you're stealing all our jobs. And so there's a loophole in the law. And the loophole in the law says if you are the son of a merchant, right, a business person, you're a naturalized U.S. citizen. So what happened in San Francisco, now remember 1906, the earthquake hit? And it wasn't the earthquake, the town lit on fire because like everything's so close and the gas lines broke, burned everything, including the courthouse. The courthouse contains the birth records. And so they made a call out afterwards saying, hey, if you are here in San Francisco and you had some kids, will you please come to the courthouse and we'll make you a new birth certificate. Every Chinese guy in town is like, yeah, I got 5 sons. I got 6 sons, right? So that's why they're called paper sons. They never existed, right? And I've actually done this class for my 8-year-old, my 8th grade class before they go and take a trip to an Asian country. And they asked me to come and speak about it. And we talked about the morality about that. And like, isn't that cheating? But it said, and the other kids chime in and they're like, well, isn't it like going around a bad law and trying to make it right? Is that a good thing? And so they got into this level of conversation. Anyways, my grandfather Bob, it cost about, what do you call it? $2,000 of 1912 money. His uncle sold a third of his farm, came here to America, came through Angel Island, which was actually a very challenging experience for anybody who's ever been to San Francisco. But the good news, he made it through. Got 5 kids through, with a 3rd grade education, put 5 kids through college, including 2 doctorates. And both Ginas, I tell you, I wouldn't be on this video camera here with you without my grandfather being that type of pioneer and risk taker. And so I hope all of you learned something here about Asian Pacific Islander heritage culture through our amazing speakers, Jolene Jang, Gina Wong, Gina Ko. We will see you next time. Look for all our additional programming through here on the Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And what is the other? Oh, yes. Stop Asian Hate. And by the way, API Heritage Month is not just one month. It's every month. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.